And we're live. So I'm here with Carson HEADY. How are you, Carson?
I'm wonderful, Matt. How you been?
Excellent. It's been a while since we talked. We did a webinar last.
I think, yeah, it was a while. Well, we've done a couple of things together. So I think the last one was with Julie and John.
That's it. That's it. So it's good to have you again. We have a really interesting conversation coming up. So I'm definitely glad to be doing this with you.
Likewise.
I want to do this a lot more regularly, just having calls like this, even if it's just casual, interesting conversations.
Agreed. I'm all for that. These are some of my favorite topics. So glad to talk about sales and B2B anytime.
Awesome. And for you folks that might not know Carson works at Microsoft, and he's awesome. That's all you need to know.
There you go. My kids love me.
Awesome. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to boost your sales in Q4, so the last quarter of the year, and a little bit about post-sell or the service, pre-sell and post-sell. So do you want to just get started? Before I ask you any questions, is there things you wanted to talk about, or should I just start and ask you questions?
Yeah, it's that time of year again. It's Q4, and I think anytime it's Q4, you start to you really examine your business and kind of where you are. And I think there's a few different categories of folks this time of year. There's folks that are blowing out their numbers. There's folks that are kind of right there on the cusp. It's this last quarter's make or break, and then there's folks that are sagging behind. And it's almost to the point of, hey, I really need to kick it in high gear. So I think the key thing is really looking at, which one are you and which actions do you need to take? And, no matter what it is, the key is focusing on process and making sure that you're not changing your mechanics that either made you successful prior or, that are what you need to be doing in order to be successful. Because I think a lot of times this time of year, folks can get desperate. They forget about timelines. And that's why they don't succeed in the fashion that they want to.
Do you think that buyers actually buy more in Q4 because they know that salespeople will be likely to discount in Q4?
Yeah, some do, for sure. I think we as salespeople a lot of times program our clients to necessarily believe that. I think there's a few different buyers in Q4. You've got to realize, number one, you've got to be in sync with their sales cycles. What's their fiscal year? When are they making budget? There's a lot of customers that have budget left right now. So it's a perfect time to sell to them. There's a lot of times where they're planning budget for next year. So it's a good time to make sure you're in lockstep with them so that they are planning to budget for your product or service. So, but yeah, absolutely. I think there's, we definitely condition our clients and potential clients a lot of times to know what is in our bag of tricks. And frankly, a lot of times it can be around some of those incentives, and even if you try to turn the tide on that, it doesn't always work out because again, we a lot of times we condition them to think that it's important to make sure that we are having a consistent relationship with the client all 4 seasons. Because if we don't want to set up that expectation, ideally we've worked with them throughout the year to sell as opportunities exist. But I absolutely do think sometimes that some clients will buy more in Q4 because of that very reason. But there's a lot of clients just for every client that will buy, there's every client that won't buy that says, hey, I'm out of money for the year, or talk to me next year, I'm out of budget. And I think that's why it's so imperative to not only be working on clients all year long as far as planning, but also prospecting in Q4 for the following year.
Is there a usual kind of trend throughout the year where maybe in the summer it's a little bit slower for B2B sales and maybe in Q4 it's usually higher? Is there a sort of yearly trends?
In most industries, yes. I mean, you're going to definitely find that depending on what industry you're working with, and also, again, the fiscal year cycles of some of these clients, you're definitely going to find some trends. And I think that's why it's important to always be hunting and farming, during the times which may be slower during the year that you find, it's very important that you're always planting those seeds and making time to prospect, making time to have new conversations, and also still being part of continuation meetings with your clients. just because you sold them something in Q1 doesn't mean that you're not continuing the conversation throughout the year, because that's where you're going to uncover additional opportunities. So absolutely, there are trends. A lot of them are very industry specific or customer specific based on their fiscal year. So it's important to understand those and then work toward them. And again, you can be having conversations. A lot of times when you're actively selling in an account, there's multiple stakeholders. So it's important to, maybe you're having discovery conversations during those slower times. But be very strategic about how you're plotting out your year, because Q4, it's kind of like in the art of war. Sun Tzu said that the war has already been won before it was fought. Frankly, your Q4 has mostly already been determined. It's kind of like any sales transaction. Before you even get to the close, you've already determined by how much activity you've done up till then, whether you've got the foundation to make the sale or not. So I really feel strongly that the selling is happening constantly. And if there are trends that are indicative of the business or of the industry, be sure that you're prospecting and making activities happen during that time.
So you're saying that, Sun Tzu said that the one is already won, so you need to prepare in advance. So what would you say salespeople should do to prepare to have a really good Q4?
Well, again, it starts at the beginning of the year. You've obviously got your changes, your new comp structures coming out, your new goals are coming out, and you get this this big strategy, and you start to look at the year, and you start to think of the different ways that you can make goal. And it's kind of like every year whenever a sports team starts their season, their scoreboard's back to zero, and the standings are back to zero, and everybody's tied. And I think that's when it all begins. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of folks, they go in different trajectories as the year goes by. So, after your first quarter, you're looking back and, hey, if you're way ahead of the curve, you're feeling good and your process is working and you keep going. I think there's a lot of people that adjust their sales and maybe change their mechanics a little bit too much after maybe a Q1 or a Q2 that was unsuccessful. And I think that's why it's so important to make sure you're focusing on process and why you're focusing on people and the connections and the clients that you're working with, your extended team and things like that. It's very important to always draw the line in the sand. Don't look back. Learn, obviously, from those experiences throughout the year, but be sure that you are continuing to look forward and apply the process. Now, the process is going to evolve, and I think that's what a lot of people don't see also. I think a lot of people will change their process drastically. Your process is going to change because there's going to be different product offerings. There's going to be different trends in the industry, like we just talked about. So it's key to be able to address those and pivot. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're still spending your time prospecting. You're still doing your outreach. You're managing your different opportunities and making sure that you're looking at each of them and saying, okay, what can I do to further the cause? That doesn't change in Q4. So your process overall should not change in Q4. And I think that's where, you've got some folks that are behind the curve and they think they need to, swing for the fences, land some big whale to hit their number. Unfortunately, some people may be in that predicament by Q4, but I don't really think the process as a whole changes. It is important to be cognizant of timelines. It is important to make sure that, you're very much in lockstep with your clients and their buying cycle. And if it's a viable deal between now and the end of the year, you need to make sure that that's plotted out. You're going to run up against holidays. You're going to run up against people being out of office. And so it's very important to be very much at the pulse of the buyer so that you understand those things and that you are communicating and on the same page when it comes to when these things need to transpire, what they need to see, what information they need, and when they will sign.
Okay, so you talked a lot about focusing on the process. Would you be able to make it a little bit more concrete and maybe have some examples of components of that process and maybe have some tips as to how to make your sales process efficient or productive or, having good results?
Certainly, it's and this is one of the things that I analyze in my book, as far as sales process is really all about, okay, we all have different sales cycles. Some of us sell products and services that are a one-call close. Some of us sell products and services that are over years. So it's very important to ultimately manage your time and manage your business. So, from the get-go, you're talking about prospecting and carving out time that you're doing that prospecting. I'm also a huge advocate of social selling, and I think that happens all the time. I mean, that's something that we invest in every day, but finding the ways to do that with a minimal time investment with maximum output and return. Furthermore, I think that we also have to do an excellent job of making sure that we are communicating, and in some case over communicating, because I think one thing that we always miss is that the sale isn't going to happen of its own volition. We've got to make sure that we're moving the ball down the field, and in order to do that, it's not always about our action. It's about making sure that boxes are being checked on the client's end. It's about making sure that you're talking to the right people that are stakeholders. I mean, how many of us have spent hours of our time chasing somebody? Turns out they're not even the decision maker, and then as soon as it turns to the decision maker, or we relied on that person we were talking to sell it to the real decision maker, the deal was kaput. So I think it's important to make sure that from a process standpoint, we're checking those boxes. We understand up front what needs to happen between now and the sale, and we are continually checking those boxes. And that's why it's important to manage these leads and manage these opportunities. It's also very important to have kind of a thermometer of these deals. What's hot, what's viable, what business is going to help us hit our number this year. Certainly, we don't want to discriminate against any potential leads or deals because any one of them can add up to a large amount. But it's imperative to understand your business and where those deals are going to come from. So those parts of process are integral. And then furthermore, making sure that we are communicating regularly with these folks, even if it's just kind of checking in. Now, I say checking in, but the reality is it's important that we're not using that terminology. You want to be unique in the way you're reaching out and actually have a legitimate reason. I like to use words like, hey, I want to make sure I'm staying on your timetable for this need that we've uncovered. Can you let me know where we sit with this? What do I owe you any information? Finding ways to stay top of mind as well. I like to integrate social selling into that. I scroll through my news feed. I look at a lot of industry specific stuff. And if I see something that strikes my interest, I'll send it directly to the client. It takes me a couple of seconds, but you stay top of mind with the client. So I think it's a lot of different ways of finding ways to work very smart, but not have to invest a ton of time into this stuff. And then finally, with the process, you've got your sales food chain. You need to make sure that you're moving across the chain toward the ultimate close. And of course, in order to do that, you've got to understand where the need is. You've got to make sure that you are speaking directly to that with a solution. And you can't leave any stones unturned. You've got to be very timely in your responsiveness. And I will say this, a lot of times clients will do business with you solely because you're the one who is the most responsive. Because be realistic, you're up against a lot of different competing solutions. And frankly, customers are going to buy from you because they believe that changing and doing what you propose is better than what they're doing right now. And if you're able to show them that path, they will buy. So again, from a process standpoint, those things always have to be there. You can't take shortcuts. And I think a lot of times in Q4, people will take shortcuts because they're desperate to close a deal. They want to just get a deal done and mark that off, put that revenue in the bank. And the reality is that if you take shortcuts, that's when the deals will absolutely have less probability of closing. Sales is a game of probability and chance. And frankly, you want to give yourself the best probability at each step of the process, but you have to put your best foot forward at each step of the process or you have no shot.
Would you say that it's correct to assume that for most buyers, if they don't, or most business leaders, if they don't spend their budget in the year, they might lose it the next year?
That happens a lot. Absolutely does. And so, sometimes that's helpful because, maybe you don't even have a necessary solution, or it may not be the solution that you originally proposed, but you might be able to get creative in different ways that your business can bring value to them that can use some of that budget. And I think that's, again, why it's so important to have those relationships and have that intimate understanding of their business.
Okay, so what about the holidays? When we get in December, right before Christmas and the office parties, people get really busy. So do you put yourself kind of a time limit of when to contact companies, or do you have a certain goal in terms of December especially, but also already in November, people are getting really busy. So how do you manage the holidays and these events happening?
Up till that point, I mean, obviously you're going to understand if making this change that you propose is a priority to them. So if it is a priority, you've got to be clear in your expectations and setting expectations and make sure that they understand, hey, these are the steps that need to, can we agree upon the steps that need to transpire between now and the time that we move forward with this project? These are the steps. Okay, we need to set these timelines. When, are there any compelling events at the end of your business year that I need to know about? Obviously, we want to be very mindful of holidays and people being out and things like that. I don't want any stress around the holiday for you guys. So I want to make sure we map this out and we get all these things delivered in a timely fashion. I think it just makes it even more imperative than usual because we're always up against timelines. Whether it's I've got to get this deal done this month, I've got to get this deal done this quarter. So we're always up against timelines. It just changes the dynamic a little bit because obviously the last couple of weeks of December, you've got pretty much zero shot at getting a deal done. The last week of November, very challenging. So it's important to understand those things, and you just understand that you have potentially three fewer weeks, maybe more, fewer weeks of selling than you would during a normal year. So that is why it is so imperative to map that out, be very forthcoming, but make it about them. Because again, I mean, if we've agreed on these steps and we've agreed on these deliverables that I need to deliver, I want to make sure we're hitting your timeline. We agree that this is a priority. So let's get this done and make sure that we're holding each other accountable to that. And I think that if you do it in a respectful fashion like that, and you're very mindful of those times to watch out for, you'll be okay.
So you mentioned earlier that salespeople are either ahead of their numbers, on track, or behind their numbers. In which category do you think that most salespeople are?
It depends on the business, but I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean, the average and the status quo is typically going to fall under goal because no organization is going to pay out the majority of their people, unless there was just a banner year, which it happens. But again, to your earlier point, then the following year, their goals are probably going to be set pretty high. But I would say the preponderance of folks are probably on the cusp with a shot at goal, if not well behind. But frankly, it obviously it varies with different businesses that folks find themselves in, but there's always a shot in Q4. I mean, there's these potential long shot Hail Mary deals that can come out of nowhere. There's a lot of exciting things that can happen, but I think the majority of folks probably find themselves in that status quo, and the average that are right there either on the cusp, missing by a little bit, or well behind. And so I think that's why for the majority of sales folks, that's why it's so important to not handle Q4 so drastically different than the rest of the year, because that's the very time when you need your process to be sound more than ever before.
So they should just keep focusing on the process.
Always. I mean, it's all about process and people. That's all selling is, making sure that you're grounded in that process, that you're able to evolve and pivot, and then also focus on people. And people means your client, making sure that you're always finding ways to add value, making sure that you're always engaging your extended team, sharing best practices within your team, and engage with your leadership and being forthcoming with them and communicating with them. If you do those things, you'll be successful in sales, period. I think far too many people get focused on numbers and they lose sight of the process, and that's when their sales go awry.
So besides focusing on the process, do you think that salespeople should focus their time or energy on something in particular in Q4 that's different than the other quarters?
No, I don't. Maybe prospecting for Q1 of the following year. However, I don't think that there's anything dramatically different other than wrapping up the loose ends. Obviously you face 4 quarter ends in a year. This is probably the most important because for most people, it is the end of their fiscal year. However, I think the process has to stay the same. You are looking at into the next year, and there's a lot of people too that I think if they're way ahead of their number, they're probably looking at, should I sandbag a deal for next year? So you're definitely going to have a different mindset, but it's important not to take the eye off the ball.
Okay, let's move on to service pre and post sell. So how much activity is really needed to go from the first call to the close?
That's a great question. And again, it's going to vary by industry and product and solution. But, because again, there's some folks that I've worked in environments where if you didn't make either very dramatic progress on call number 1 or close it, you may not ever talk to the client again. And then I've worked in environments where these relationships are cultivated over years, And there may be deals that take years to get done, very long term. And I think that's because things have changed so much in the world we live in that we're looking at a lot of different variables and what's the future going to be like and trying to plan longer term. So I think sometimes those buying cycles can be all over the board. The steps that need to take place are locating the key decision makers and stakeholders and making sure that you're having the conversations with them at a very high level. Don't be short-sighted. Listen. Make sure that you truly understand what their business looks like, what their needs are, what their pain points are. Because ideally, you're going to have to match your solution to a need, a gap in their process. Because again, they are just like we are. They are process focused, they are people focused, and there's varying levels of that within their organization. But it's important to understand that they have pain points and they have things that, from a feedback perspective, that are very valuable to you. So that's why it's so imperative that we understand that. The next steps are going to be determined by those conversations. Ideally, you're going to uncover multiple needs in those conversations, and you're going to be able to kind of match them to different services and solutions that you have to offer. And if that's the case, then it's important to kind of connect all those dots. And you may not be going to the same places to get those answers. Customers a lot of times are going to ask you for, rely on you for resources. And sometimes they want free information, and it's almost impossible sometimes to discern that. With experience, you can get better at it, but sometimes it can be very well guarded. And so you are ultimately going to be asked to provide information and value. And obviously, you're going to want to be talking about the different types of value that you can bring to them and value that you brought to customers in similar situations, because case studies and experience references are often very important. So between that and the sale, there's going to be check-ins, and there's going to be knowledge shares, and there's going to be situations where you are transacting with the data that they've requested or that you guys have discussed. There may be different things that they need to see, whether it's a demo of your product or service, whether it's a testimonial, whether it's talking to references. So, ultimately, it's going to be determined in those early conversations. And other things may pop up along the way too. You may also be in a competitive situation. So it's important to understand the landscape of the customer that you're talking to, their pain points, but it's also important to understand your competition and what you may be up against, whether that's another product or service that's similar, or whether you're up against timelines, whether you're up against how quickly your team can deliver, those sorts of things. So understanding all those variables up front and as early as possible is important. But those check-ins are vital too, because you can't spend too much time. I mean, the client is the center of your universe, and you got to make sure you treat them as such. If you spend too much of time in any relationship neglecting the other party, sorry, but the love is going to fade a little bit. So it's very important to be checking in and just making sure, maybe you had another member of your team engage with that client. Check in with them. Ask how the call went. Just little things. These little pieces of the process can go a long way when you're building a foundation toward a sale. And then I guess the last part is obviously you're working toward the close. There's different pieces that go into that. I mean, there could be negotiation. And again, we talked about timelines earlier. It's so vital to make sure that you're leaving enough time for if there needs to be a negotiation, if there needs to be some sort of payment structure that's put together. So that's why it's so vital to make sure you're leaving plenty of time to do all these things, your regular check-ins, and that if there are any changes, that you can quickly pivot instead of letting the deal go south. Finally, you get to the close, and you get to the part where you make your ultimate presentation, or you present the deal. And the deal can be shaped in any number of ways. Sometimes it's very simple. It's, hey, this is the product. Do you want it or not? Ultimately, are you going to sign off on it? Is this, how are we going to move forward? And then other times it's very hands-on from a client perspective, and it's an ongoing service engagement. So, I think that's where from the start until the close, those are kind of the pieces of the process. And again, you want to make sure you're putting your best foot forward. But again, it really all comes down to communication.
What do you think are the consequences if you don't pay enough attention to your customers pre-sale and post-sale?
I love the post-sale part. We talked about this a moment ago. If you're not paying enough attention to anyone in a relationship, that interest and that love is going to fade. So if we come out of the gate so strong, right? I mean, we get a meeting with the client, we're all excited, we have this conversation with them, and we're talking about all this magical stuff we can do for them. But the magic fades, and the key thing is then they actually need to see action and results. One thing I love doing is actually sitting in the client meeting and connecting the dots that I say that I'm going to do right there while I'm there. So maybe sending an email to another team member saying, hey, how can we get this? Or getting a resource for them right there while I'm sitting there. Because let's face it, once we leave that meeting, we're on high. We're like, hey, I found 5 different opportunities in that meeting. As time passes, that feeling of euphoria fades. Same thing for the customer. You know, they might have heard a lot of great things that you had to say, but if you're not keeping in touch with them, showing them those deliverables, there is no sale. And even if there is, and maybe, you know, sometimes what I hate is when a lot of times you can see bad behavior rewarded with the sale. So maybe it's that false sense of gratification where we didn't take the proper steps, or we did a really bad job of selling the deal, but we still got it. So it almost reinforced our bad behavior. And that's why I think it's important because then we don't understand when a deal doesn't get done because that bad behavior worked before. So that's why I think it's so important to make sure that we're in lockstep with the client every step of the way. We're checking in, touching base, but please don't use that language. Don't say I'm touching base. Don't say I'm checking in. I'm just reaching out to make sure that you're seeing what you need to see, making sure you've gotten all the answers that you need, see what questions exist, make sure I'm following up on your timeline, that sort of thing. So I think, you know, pre-sales, it all hinges on your communication. Post-sales, different story. I think there's a lot of folks that will sell something and then they move on. The relationship dies. You know, you may have gotten that. You may have gotten a good sale there, but if you understood the business and you saw opportunity there, I mean, who's to say that not by continuing to cultivate that relationship that there couldn't be more opportunity? It could be being in their status meetings. It could be just checking in with them on a quarterly basis, see how the product and service is working, see what questions they have, see if you can connect them with somebody helpful within your support division. So there's a lot of benefit to doing post-sale. I've run post-sales groups before that literally called to check in a month later down the road. And you find a lot of opportunities there because they're starting to utilize your product and service. They're seeing the good and the bad. And by addressing the gaps in process, by addressing the solution, the issues that they're having with the solution, you can uncover additional sales opportunities. And that's where, I think a lot of folks miss the boat, because by taking great care of your customer post-sales and not just selling it and running, you can uncover a lot of additional opportunities. And that's the other piece to that too, is a lot of times I've seen where clients post-sales, because I maintained the relationship, referred me to other new clients. And you can literally set up a well of referral business because of those relationships. Selling today is all about relationships. And frankly, that's something that 10 years ago when I wrote my first book, I didn't know as much as I know today in that regard. I kind of kick myself sometimes because I had no idea what I was doing when I wrote a sales book in my 20s. I look back and selling is all about relationships, especially in this day and age. There's so many different ways that we can get connected. And I think that's why it's important to take advantage of social media to broker those meetings, but nothing replaces the face-to-face and having those relationships and continuing to try to find ways to add value. I've even introduced clients to people at competitors because I knew that they were buying that solution and I had a relationship with the guy at the competitor. Why not help them out? It wasn't a conflict for me at the time because, frankly, I knew they weren't going to buy my solution, but I knew a guy at the competitor, and absolutely, I'll broker that conversation because, again, people are going to turn to you because you add value. So that post-sales relationship is just as important, if not more so, than the pre-sales relationship.
Carson, how can people learn more from you? I know you have books. Do you want to maybe plug them here a little bit? And how can people stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I love connecting on social media. I do a lot on LinkedIn. I've got a blog on WordPress. I've gotten 3 books. I don't know how I found the time. Writing a book is one of the most daunting things ever. There's been many times where I was mid-book and I was just like, this is never going to be finished. But so my first book, Birth of a Salesman, came out in 2010. My second was A Salesman Against the World. And my third is A Salesman Forever. And those 3 books are now actually available via an anthology, an ebook anthology as well. So you can easily find them through Barnes & Noble and Amazon. And like I said, I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, Twitter, and love the socials. So would love to connect with anyone and everyone eager to talk about sales and leadership.
Thank you so much, Carson. Hopefully we're going to do some more of these calls and maybe with the other geniuses as well. That was interesting. But definitely for today, a big thanks. And you've mentioned a lot of gold nuggets in there. So I'm going to be sure to go back and listen to it again.
Anytime, Matt. I'm glad that we've maintained this relationship.
Talk to you soon.
Sounds great. Take care.